Thank you, Maria. It's wonderful to be here in Bogota, participating in ACP's 50th anniversary conference. Yesterday, several speakers spoke about unconventional reservoirs and what's happening in the United States, and a few of them connected that to what has happened to global oil prices over the last 12 months. So what I'd like to do today is build on those observations that you heard yesterday, try to give you a little more detail about unconventional reservoirs. I'm going to show you one slide about ConocoPhillips' unconventional reservoir business in the United States and Canada, and then I'll finish my talk by talking about Colombia's unconventional reservoir potential and what it might take to have a success story here in Colombia like what has been achieved in the United States. Before I get started, because ConocoPhillips is a publicly traded company, I need to show you this slide, and I know you can't read the words. But basically what it says is that ConocoPhillips doesn't have a perfect crystal ball. We can't predict the future. I'll be making some forward-looking statements and realize there's some uncertainty around how the future may unfold. Okay, so my first diagram here is one where I'd like to try to give you all the geologic information you need to know about what's different between unconventional reservoirs and conventional reservoirs. So for this slide, I need to borrow your imagination for a moment. Think about standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon in the United States, looking out across the Colorado River, and imagine you're looking at the rock formations on the far side. And what you see in the diagram are a number of rock layers, and I'd like to describe for you just how the petroleum systems differ between unconventional reservoirs and conventional reservoirs. So if you look at the black-colored rock formation near the bottom of the slide, that's meant to represent a mature source rock, a rock with a lot of organic matter in it, which has been heated up and has now produced oil and natural gas. And of course, for about 150 years, our industry has been looking for oil and gas in the Earth's crust, but we've always been looking for the migrated hydrocarbons. The hydrocarbons that came out of the source rock and worked its way up through the Earth's crust into what we call traps. And of course, our industry's done extremely well. We found enormous volumes of hydrocarbons, thousands of billions of barrels of oil equivalent. But there is actually another target in the Earth's crust, and that is the source rocks themselves. Sometimes these are referred to as shales, but in reality, they're really those organic-rich rocks like the Luna Formation here in Colombia. And just in the last few years, we found ways to extract the hydrocarbons from these rocks. It's not that these hydrocarbons were not known about by the industry. Frankly, there were a number of people over the last 150 years who tried to find ways to extract those hydrocarbons. I mean, it's a little bit like the story of trying to find the mythical city of El Dorado, right? People looked and said, well, there's great gold and wealth out there, but I need to find some way to get it out of the Earth's crust. What's been exciting in the last 10 years is that industry has found a way to combine two very old technologies. Hydraulic fracturing, which has been around since the 1940s, over 1 million wells hydraulically fractured in the US, over 2 million around the world, and combine that with horizontal drilling. And the reason that's important is that with hydraulic fracturing in vertical wells, you could never get a commercial rate out of those unconventional source rocks. But when you combine hydraulic fracturing with the horizontal drilling, suddenly instead of putting a few fracture stimulations into the reservoir, we can put in literally hundreds of fractures, and we can get rates which are highly commercial if the rock is the right type of rock. So what I would like to do next is show you how the US industry has taken this new tool, hydraulically stimulated horizontal wells, and extracted great wealth as a result of it. So I've got two graphs here. The one on the left I'll talk to first. It looks at the gas production in the US since the turn of the century. And what you see is that conventional gas production, which is shown in orange at the bottom part of the slide, that's been going down for the last 15 years. And frankly, around the turn of the century, America realized that conventional natural gas production had peaked. The reason you know that's a true statement is that around the coastlines of the US, there were a number of LNG import terminals built because everyone thought that a large amount of liquefied natural gas was going to need to be imported into America. But starting in about 2005, the industry, using this new tool, has been able to unlock an incredible volume of gas. So what you see there is the red wedge, the curve going almost straight up. Today, the U.S. is producing almost 75 billion cubic feet of gas per day, and over 40% of that is coming from unconventional reservoirs. So this is the real kind of core of the unconventional success story. It started in the Barnett Shale. It's moved around into a number of other fields in the U.S. But perhaps an even better story is the story told by the graph on the right. This is oil production in the U.S., and you see in that graph that oil production reached a peak of around 10 million barrels, or just a little less than 10 million barrels a day in 1970. And that was all coming from conventional reservoirs, those migrated hydrocarbons I talked about earlier. But after the 70s and the early 80s, you can see that oil production started to fall precipitously. And in fact, by 2005, production was down to a very low level. But the real breakthrough in the unconventionals came in 2010, when the industry realized you could extract not only natural gas from unconventional reservoirs, but also oil. So take a look at that green spike on the right side of the slide. That is the oil production added in the last 5 years from unconventional reservoirs, almost 5 million barrels of oil per day. So an absolutely incredible comeback story. If you add up the gas and the oil from unconventional reservoirs, you get a number that's somewhere between 9 and 10 million barrels of oil equivalent per day, all of which has been added in the last 10 years. And if you compare that to countries around the planet, that is more production than is coming out of every country except for the US, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. So an absolutely incredible story, and I think given those slides there, you can see why the unconventional reservoirs have had a transformational impact upon our industry. On this next slide, what I'd like to do is show you the main fields that are driving this incredible production growth. As you can imagine, if you've added almost 9 to 10 million barrels of oil equivalent per day of production, you have to have some really big fields. In the story in the US, there's a number of unconventional fields. I've only shown 4 here on this slide, but these are the really big ones. So on the liquid-rich side, the oil side, you're looking at the Eagle Ford, the Bakken, and the Permian Basin. And then on the gas side, the real workhorse is the Marcellus. Many of you, or most of you, are in the oil and gas industry, so you know the volumes that are up there on the slide are enormous. On the oil side, those are billions of barrels of oil equivalent. And on the gas side, trillions of cubic feet of gas. So if you look at the oil fields, all 3 of these unconventional reservoir fields are likely to be bigger than the biggest conventional field ever found in America, Prudhoe Bay. And on the gas side, the Marcellus is the biggest gas field by far. So this has been an absolutely transformational journey. I think the one thing as a geologist, I'm a geologist by training, one thing that's a little bit embarrassing is that it took us 150 years to find the biggest natural gas field and the biggest oil field in America. You would think we would have found it a bit sooner. But this is really the crux of the story around the renaissance in the oil and gas industry in the US. But it's a story that applies not just to the oil and gas industry. As is shown on this next slide, this growth in oil and gas production has had an enormous impact on the US economy as a whole. So this information is from a study by Michael Porter at Harvard University. With Harvard University, of course, being the university your country's president graduated from. I actually think he graduated from 2 different universities, Harvard and London Business School. But take a look at these numbers. Jobs up 2.7 million. You can see the GDP growth there, and that's on a per capita basis, so over $1,000 per person in the US. So jobs up, GDP up, and you can see the cost of fuel has gone down significantly, as well as the US federal budget deficit. So this is an event which hasn't just played out in the oil and gas industry space, but is actually having a big impact on the country as a whole. So I've been asked a few times to sum up the history of our industry in one slide, and this is my attempt to do so, or at least from the resource discovery side. What you see on the slide is the 156-year history of our industry, and really the four big events that have occurred that have added enormous volumes of resources, the resources that are powering the globe today. So for the first 50 years of the industry, there really wasn't much oil and gas found. Frankly, there weren't many engineering or scientific tools that were being applied. People were using dowsing sticks and kind of drilling where other people had found oil and gas in the past. But frankly, that probably wasn't too big a problem because there wasn't much demand for oil and gas. But shortly after the start of the 20th century, with the introduction of the automobile, demand for the product took off, and the industry responded by applying science and engineering. And you can see in that big green wedge on the slide, the bulk of the world's onshore conventional resources were found in a relatively short period of time, about a half-century's period of time. So this is the discovery of the giant fields in Texas and Oklahoma, in the Middle East, North Africa, the former Soviet Union, Northern South America. Literally thousands of billions of barrels of oil equivalent discovered, and during the peak years, over 100 billion barrels of oil equivalent discovered per year. So an absolutely amazing time in the industry, and probably one that the industry thought would never come again. As the onshore discovery period began to wind down, the industry moved into the offshore, started in the Gulf of Mexico in the late 1940s, and then moved around the planet in the 60s and 70s. First in shallow water, and today in deep water. In fact, Joel Busby is going to be talking about deep water immediately after my presentation. And another period of enormous discovery. But as we go out into the 21st century, we're seeing some limits to the offshore resource base as well. And so somewhat fortuitously, unconventional reservoirs have come along at just the right time. And what I've shown there is a volume of oil and gas shaded in, which more or less represents what's been found in North America to date, because this has been a North American story. And our best estimate is that somewhere around 250 billion barrels of oil equivalent that has been discovered in unconventional reservoirs. And that's a staggering number. It's probably at least as large as the conventional resource base in the US. And what I've shown on the slide to the right then is a dashed line. And where that dashed line goes is really going to be a function of what happens internationally. And I'll talk about it a little bit more in a few slides. Looking around the planet, there is reason to be optimistic that these giant fields being found in America could be found elsewhere, that it could transform economies just like it did in the US. But there are also a series of challenges that need to be overcome to make that future happen. But before I do that, I do want to show you one slide about ConocoPhillips. I know that we are relatively new to Colombia, but we are a company that has a very big position in unconventional reservoirs. So on this slide, a number of facts down the left-hand side, some information about our capital spending on the right. One thing I noticed this morning I hadn't put on there was our overall production rate. Today we're producing a bit over 300,000 barrels of oil equivalent from unconventional reservoirs in the US and Canada. So about 1/3 of a million barrels of oil equivalent per day, so not a trivial amount of hydrocarbons. And all of these hydrocarbons, or all of this production, has been added since 2010. So an incredible story, going from near zero to 300,000 barrels of oil equivalent in 5 years. The reason we've been able to do this, we have very good positions in the Eagle Ford play, in the Bakken, in the Permian, so the big three US liquid-rich plays, and we also have a big position in Western Canada. Skip down the list of bullet points a bit. Technical expertise. As Maria was mentioning, my job is to manage ConocoPhillips's unconventional reservoir technology program. And this is an exciting area. I wanted to put some slides in here about the technology changes that are occurring, because it's really been transformational. And it's important to understand, because what's happening in unconventionals today is that we are finding ways to reduce the cost of production and reduce that cost significantly. And because of that, we can still produce a large volume of oil and natural gas at what would seem like relatively low oil prices. And so if you look at the graph on the right, what that shows is ConocoPhillips' worldwide capital budget for 2015 and what we're projecting for 2017. And so this year we're going to spend about $11.5 billion around the planet, and you can see it's broken into a number of different buckets. Base production is existing fields, basically keeping the facilities in good shape. Then we have conventional and unconventional development, that's mostly onshore development activity, and then major projects. And these major projects are enormous LNG projects that we are executing in Australia, and oil sand projects in Canada. And you can see that takes up a large part of our current budget. But going forward, we see that portion of our budget going down and unconventionals expanding, and you can see the numbers there are pretty significant. So a 70% expansion in spending on unconventional reservoirs between now and 2017. And the reasons behind that is, as I said, we have dramatically reduced the cost of producing an unconventional barrel of oil. So these are some of the most profitable opportunities in our portfolio, things like the Eagle Ford play in South Texas. But the other characteristics of these opportunities, which the industry is really excited about, is that they are incredibly flexible. So instead of having to make a commitment to an LNG project, whereas once I sign the authority for expenditure, I'm committed for billions of dollars of investment over multiple years, and if oil prices go down, I still need to spend. With the unconventionals, we can ramp up or down the level of investment depending upon what's happening in the world as far as oil and natural gas prices. So these are some of the big drivers that are affecting ConocoPhillips' plans, and they're also drivers that have begun to affect the entire industry. So these are some of the mega trends, if you will, that are occurring. All right, so turning to Colombia. There's a lot of positive attributes about Colombia that I could list as far as the oil and gas industry in general and unconventional reservoirs in particular. I mean, the success story here over the last few years has been wonderful. You got production up over 1 million barrels a day. I mean, it was very encouraging to hear some of the comments yesterday about how the ministries are trying to support oil and gas development, recognizing the large positive impacts that could have on the country's economy. But the two attributes that I want to call out on this slide are associated with the quality of the source rocks and the geographic size of Colombia. So I've got the same map I showed you earlier with the oil and gas fields in the US, and I apologize, at the time I didn't describe the color coding on the slide, although you can probably read it off the bottom, but the green dots are oil wells, red dots gas wells, yellow condensate, and gray are dry holes. You can see there's been a lot of drilling in the US, more than anywhere else on the planet. But if you look at the size of Colombia, I mean, it's a big country. I actually didn't realize how large it was until this graphic was put together. And I'm from Texas, live in Houston, and Texans are very proud of Texas, right? You may have met some Texans, and they're somewhat boastful at times, although, you know, we're more humble than you might think. And everyone thinks everything is bigger and best in Texas, right? But when I look at that map, well, Colombia is much bigger than Texas. So I'm gonna have to go back to Houston and report to my colleagues that Texas is not bigger than Colombia. And size matters in this game. You want to have a big area to exploit. And then the other attribute, which is really encouraging, is the quality of the source rocks. La Luna is probably one of the world's best source rocks, deposited in a warm sea on the north coast of South America 80 plus million years ago. This rock was deposited at exactly the same time as the Eagle Ford was being deposited in South Texas. So at that time in the Earth's history, the Earth was much, much warmer than it is today. And a lot of organic matter was being deposited in the Earth's oceans, and these are the source rocks that have helped drive the oil and gas production from conventional reservoirs, and are some of the best targets for unconventional. So you've got great source rocks, a big geographic area, and it sounds like a winning combination, and in many ways it could be, but I want to take a look next at what has really driven the success story in America, and what I'm going to suggest to you is it's not about the quality of the rocks. And the reason I say that is if you look at the quality of the rocks in the US, they are modest at best. So look at the graph on the right first. This is just worldwide conventional reserves. And I've bucketed it up by major geographic areas, starting with the Middle East. Everyone knows the Middle East is the part of the planet that has the most oil and gas resources. And then, other buckets. And look where the U.S. falls. I mean, the U.S. is one of the most modest oil and gas accumulations of any part of the planet. Even if you add back the oil and gas that had been produced during the last 150 years, this picture would not change much. So if you think about what's happened, this enormous revolution in unconventional reservoirs in North America, and if you look at the very first bullet on that slide, the U.S. has been the world's largest oil producer for all but 40 years. So how did this happen if the rocks really weren't that good? Well, it has to do with some of the bullets further down. Some people would suggest, well, it must be that Americans are smarter than everybody else. So how many people in the room believe that? No. I can tell you I've traveled all around the globe. I'm hopeful Americans are at least as smart as people in other parts of the world, but I can tell you it's not about the brain power. I don't think it's about, someone mentioned yesterday, low interest rates. Yeah, that's helped the unconventional reservoir revolution, but that isn't the driver. There's a lot of infrastructure in the U.S., but that isn't the magic formula for success. If you really look at what's happened, it's really the three bullets down the bottom. So for 150 years, people have been encouraged to take risk, to go out and try new things, look for oil and gas in places where no one ever thought oil and gas could be found. I mean, unconventional reservoirs, frankly, were the least obvious place to look. When I went to university, my professors, and this was a good university in California, my professor said, only thing that source rocks are good for are a place where oil and gas are created, and sometimes they can actually act as seals to prevent oil and gas from escaping from the Earth's crust. But there were some Americans who said, well, I'm going to give that a try. And the system, the legal system, the fiscal system, the regulatory system in the U.S. allowed them to chase their dreams. If you look at what that implies, I think, for the rest of the world, where these next successes will come will not necessarily be where the best rocks are. I mean, we know there's incredible source rocks in Russia, but we don't expect unconventional reservoirs to get going there very quickly. Instead, it's going to be these other factors. And like I said, it was encouraging yesterday to hear the Minister of Mines and Energy talk about how Colombia is working to try to make the regulatory and permitting processes more conducive to oil and gas development. The third bullet down, I think, is a good one to look at. Really in the U.S., what we have is fit-for-purpose regulations. And what we see in many parts of the world, people come up with good-intentioned ideas about how to regulate our industry, but quite often they're incredibly complex. They create a lot of drag, if you will, on the approval process. There might be multiple organizations that need to approve things. So sorting that out and getting a fit-for-purpose regulatory framework is really a big plus. The dialogue, what we call power and cooperation, talking to each other, has really been a success story. And probably one of the bits of really good news, I think, for Colombia is when we look at the world, we think South America is going to be one of the places where unconventional reservoirs first emerge as an international oil and gas opportunity set. I've got a log on here. If you're in the oil and gas industry, you recognize the Vaca Muerta is down in Argentina. Argentina's got a bit of a lead on Colombia. They're up to 40,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day. So they are off and running. But, at ConocoPhillips, I think we're hopeful that Colombia could be a winner in the long term in the race to be a large producer of unconventional reservoir oil and natural gas. It's been a transformational story in America. It certainly has transformed our company. I don't know where ConocoPhillips would be if not for the 300,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day that we're producing. We have gone out around the planet looking for other places. We tried to get into China. We weren't successful. But we're hopeful that we can work with the Colombian government and find a way to test the potential here. I mean, there's no guarantees that it will work, but test the potential and see if we can't recreate some of the successes that we've achieved elsewhere. And you think about what that could mean to Colombia. These reservoirs are capable of producing hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil equivalent. The best reservoirs, the Eagle Ford, is producing 2.5 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. So 2.5 times all the production in Colombia. So this is an enormous opportunity, and really an opportunity for industry and the Colombian government to seize the day and see what can be made of it. Okay, so last slide. You've been a wonderful audience. I really just wanted to sum up a few messages you might think about taking away from this talk. Realize you've seen a lot of PowerPoint slides yesterday. You'll see a lot more today. Tried to make these messages short, memorable. I guess if I was to sum up those 5 messages on there, it would be this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, an absolutely transformational event, an event that is changing our industry. It's creating some challenges. The price of oil has gone down by more than half. So that is a very difficult challenge for our industry to overcome. But it's also created a lot of opportunity. And I think it is the companies and countries that seize that opportunity that are going to be successful in the long term. So thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. And wonderful to have had the chance to be with you here in Bogota today.